The torrential late October rain fell on New York City, not as a cleansing force, but as a cold, indifferent curtain smearing the neon glow of Times Square across the slick asphalt. Inside his $3.2 million Pagani Huayra, Julian Vance was insulated from it all. The world outside was a muted, blurry spectacle, a distant reality he observed from within a climate-controlled cocoon of hand-stitched leather and polished carbon fiber. The soft hum of the engine was a purr of absolute power, a sound that mirrored the rhythm of his own life, controlled, dominant, and moving at a speed few could comprehend. He tapped his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel, the percussive sound a stark contrast to the classical music whispering from the bespoke sound system. The city, his city, was merely a backdrop for his commute from one sterile tower of power to another, its millions of lives utterly inconsequential to his trajectory. A sudden burst of red and blue light violently tore through the calm of his private world, flashing erratically in his rearview mirror and painting his impassive face in jarring, alternating hues. A siren, faint at first, grew into an insistent wail that pierced the car's soundproofing. Annoyance, cold and sharp, was the first emotion to register. It was the irritation of a god having his path momentarily blocked by a net. He smoothly guided the hypercar to the curb, the vehicle's profile looking like a grounded spaceship against the gritty backdrop of a darkened side street. As the patrol car pulled in behind him, a figure emerged into the downpour. Officer Michael Evans was not an imposing man. His frame was lean beneath the soaked, standard-issue nipped raincoat, but he moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace that spoke of a deep-seated composure, a stark and immediate contrast to the volatile energy radiating from the man he was approaching. Officer Evans tapped lightly on the driver's side window, the raindrops clinging to his eyelashes as he peered inside. Julian lowered the window just a crack, allowing the damp, grimy air of the city to invade his sanctuary. "License and registration, sir," Evans said, his voice steady and professional, devoid of either deference or aggression. He was simply a man doing his job. Julian passed the documents through the gap with a sigh of theatrical boredom, not even bothering to make eye contact. He watched the officer's face illuminated by his flashlight as he reviewed the information. "Mr. Vance," Evans began, his gaze lifting from the license to meet Julian's for the first time. "I clocked you doing 80 in a 45 zone, and you swerved across 2 lanes back there. Have you had anything to drink tonight?" The question was rote, procedural, yet to Julian it was an unprecedented affront, a challenge to his very existence. The carefully constructed fortress of Julian Vance's composure didn't just crack, it atomized. A cold, derisive smirk twisted his lips. The idea of being subjected to such a pedestrian inquiry was so absurd, so fundamentally wrong in his universe, that it was almost amusing. He leaned forward, his eyes, which had managed global markets and brokered billion-dollar deals, narrowing into slits of pure venom. The ambient noise of the rain and the city seemed to fade into a dull roar as he focused entirely on the unassuming officer standing in the downpour. His voice, when it came out, was not loud, but a low, menacing hiss, dripping with the weight of his entire empire. "Do you have any idea who I am?" The question hung in the damp air, an assertion of power meant to crush and intimidate. Unseen by Julian, a small, blinking red light on Officer Evans' chest-mounted body camera silently and faithfully recorded every syllable, every nuance of the sneer, capturing the precise moment a Titan's hubris sealed his own fate. This single moment, captured on a tiny camera lens, would unravel a billion-dollar empire. If you're already feeling the tension, subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching this incredible story unfold. The aftermath of the roadside encounter left no immediate ripple in Julian's world. He returned to his penthouse, a sprawling expanse of glass and steel overlooking Central Park, and poured himself a glass of 25-year-old scotch. The incident was an annoyance, a bureaucratic gnat to be swatted away by his legal team. He made the call to Arthur Croft, his lead counsel, a man whose annual retainer was more than the officer's lifetime earnings. Julian recounted the event with a tone of detached amusement, focusing on the sheer audacity of the officer. "Arthur," Ever the professional assured him it was a non-issue. A few calls would be made, a generous donation to the right fund would be offered, and the entire matter would be expunged before it ever saw a clerk's desk. Julian believed him, because this was how his world operated. Problems weren't solved. They were erased with money. His home was less a sanctuary and more a museum of wealth, curated to project an image of impeccable taste, but utterly devoid of personal warmth. White marble floors stretched into rooms filled with minimalist furniture that looked more like art installations than places for human comfort. There were no family photos on the gleaming surfaces, no scuff marks on the floors, no books left open on a coffee table. It was the immaculate, sterile environment of a man who had systematically amputated every personal connection that might introduce the chaos of emotion into his life. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights a glittering carpet at his feet, yet he felt a profound, gnawing emptiness. He was the king of a silent, lonely castle, and the encounter on the street had, for a reason he couldn't yet articulate, made the silence feel a little louder tonight. The next morning, this feeling was ruthlessly suppressed. At Nexus Dynamics headquarters, Julian was a different entity. He moved through the lobby like a predator, employees parting before him, their gazes a mixture of fear and reverence. His office, occupying the entire top floor, was an echo of his home, but on a corporate scale. It was a cathedral of technological power, with interactive data walls and a single, imposing desk made from a slab of obsidian. Here, he was not a man but a concept, the visionary, the titan, the architect of the future. His interactions were brief, clipped, and brutally efficient. He didn't manage people. He moved assets, and his employees were the most disposable assets of all. His praise was non-existent, and his criticism was a precise surgical weapon that could dismantle a career in under a minute. This persona was a shield forged in the fires of a brutal upbringing. Julian hadn't been born into this world. He had conquered it. His father was a small-time, perpetually failing businessman who saw Julian's burgeoning intellect not with pride, but with bitter resentment. Julian's youth was a relentless series of humiliations, of being told he was worthless, of watching his father's pathetic attempts to command respect. He had sworn to himself that he would never be that man. He would build an empire so vast and unassailable that no one would ever question his worth again. Power became his surrogate for love, wealth his replacement for self-esteem, and control his defense against the terrifying vulnerability his father had embodied. In his relentless climb, he had shed everything he considered a weakness. A college sweetheart who had talked of a simple life was left behind. His relationship with his sister fractured after he missed her wedding for a crucial merger deal in Tokyo. They hadn't spoken in a decade. He viewed these sacrifices not as losses, but as necessary costs of victory. He had convinced himself that the view from the summit was worth the solitary journey. Yet, the memory of the officer's calm, unimpressed eyes kept intruding upon his thoughts. It was a gaze that had not acknowledged the titan of industry, but had simply seen a man, potentially drunk, driving recklessly. For the first time in years, someone had seen him without the filter of his wealth, and the reflection was unsettling. Arthur Croft and his team of legal sharks operated with the cold efficiency Julian admired. Their initial strategy was textbook for dealing with the city's bureaucracy. They filed a motion to dismiss based on a technicality in the filing procedure, a common tactic designed to clog the system and force a quiet resolution. They simultaneously reached out through back channels to the precinct captain, implying that a significant contribution to the Police Benevolent Association could make this whole unfortunate misunderstanding disappear. It was a two-pronged attack of legal obfuscation and financial persuasion, a strategy that had successfully neutralized dozens of similar, albeit smaller, problems for Julian in the past. They assured him the bodycam footage would never be seen by anyone outside of a dusty evidence locker. While Julian's world revolved around power and influence, Officer Michael Evans' world revolved around a worn-out kitchen table in a two-bedroom apartment in Queens. After his shift ended, he took the long, rattling subway ride home, the day's grime and exhaustion settling deep into his bones. The train car was a cross-section of the city Julian only ever saw from above: tired nurses, construction workers, students, a mosaic of ordinary lives filled with struggles and small dignities. Michael didn't feel superior or inferior to any of them. He was one of them. His vulnerability was his humanity. He wasn't insulated from the city's harsh realities. He was immersed in them every single day, a fact that gave him a perspective Julian could never comprehend. He walked into his apartment, and the scent of garlic and simmering tomato sauce immediately washed away the city's stench. His 4-year-old daughter, Lily, shrieked with delight and ran into his arms, wrapping her small hands around his neck. His wife, Sarah, a schoolteacher with kind, weary eyes, smiled at him from the stove. Here, he wasn't Officer Evans. He was Mike. He was Daddy. The apartment was small. The furniture was second-hand, and they were always worried about making ends meet. But it was a home filled with a richness that would have been alien in Julian's penthouse. It was a warmth built not from money, but from love, laughter, and the shared burden of a life lived together. This was the true source of his strength, the moral anchor that kept him steady. Later that night, as Lily slept, he told Sarah about the traffic stop. He didn't describe it with anger or relish, but with a quiet sense of disappointment. He just couldn't believe it, Michael said, staring into his cup of tea. He looked at me like I was a malfunctioning appliance, not a person. Do you know who I am? As if that's a magical phrase that erases the law, Sarah took his hand, her brow furrowed with worry. She knew the world better than to believe in fairy tales of justice. A man like that, Mike, he can make trouble, real trouble. Are you sure you should have pushed it? Her fear was not for his career, but for their family's safety and stability, a fragile ecosystem that a man like Vance could destroy without a second thought. Michael squeezed her hand reassuringly, though a part of him shared her concern. I did my job, Sarah, exactly by the book. That's all I can do. If we start letting the rich and powerful write their own rules, what's the point of any of it? The badge is supposed to mean something. It's supposed to mean the law is the same for everyone. His conviction was simple, profound, and deeply ingrained. It wasn't a grand philosophy. It was the fundamental principle he relied on to make sense of the chaos he policed every day. He had to believe in it. He logged the bodycam footage into evidence, his report meticulously detailed, factual, and completely devoid of emotion. He had done his part. The rest was up to the system. At the 17th precinct, his captain, a grizzled veteran named Connolly, called him into his office. Connolly had seen it all, and he knew the scent of trouble. Evans, he said, leaning back in his squeaky chair, this Vance report. You dotted all your I's and crossed your T's. I see that. But you need to understand what you've kicked here. This isn't some punk kid. This is Julian Vance. He owns judges. He dines with senators. He can end a career with a phone call. The warning was clear. Be prepared. The department would back him as long as his paperwork was clean, but they wouldn't go to war for a patrolman against a billionaire. Michael was, for all intents and purposes, on his own. The carefully laid plans of Julian's legal team were incinerated overnight. An anonymous source, likely a disgruntled clerk in the DA's office, leaked the bodycam footage to a major online news outlet. By sunrise, the video was everywhere. It was the lead story on every morning news program, the top trending topic on every social media platform. The clip was devastatingly clear. The audio picked up the condescending tone, the hiss of Julian's voice, the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of his question. Stripped of the context of his wealth and power, he was just an ugly, entitled man bullying a public servant. The video didn't just tell a story. It showed his soul. Julian woke up to a blizzard of frantic calls from his PR department. He turned on the television and saw his own face, sneering back at him, played on a loop. His stomach plunged. This wasn't supposed to happen. The world was supposed to bend to his will. Instead, it was laughing at him. The carefully curated image he had spent a lifetime building was being dismantled in real time by a 2-minute video clip. He hurled his crystal glass against the wall, where it shattered into 1,000 pieces, the expensive scotch dripping down the pristine white paint like blood. The silence of his penthouse was now filled with the echo of his own public humiliation. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. "Do you know who I am?" became an instant meme, a national punchline for arrogance and entitlement. Late-night hosts built entire monologues around it. Parody videos flooded the internet. More seriously, the stock of Nexus Dynamics took a nosedive. Investors were spooked, not by the legal trouble itself, but by the glimpse into the unstable character of its CEO. The board of directors, a group of people Julian had always treated as mere formalities, called an emergency meeting. The empire he had built as a fortress was suddenly besieged, and the attack was coming from the ghost of his own voice. For Michael Evans, the leak was a different kind of storm. His quiet life vanished. Reporters camped outside his apartment building, shouting questions at him as he tried to take Lily to the park. His face was now as public as Julian's, but he was cast as the everyman hero, the symbol of quiet dignity in the face of elite corruption. It was a role he never asked for and was deeply uncomfortable with. He just wanted to be a cop, a husband, a father. Instead, he was a character in a media narrative, his life's story simplified into a headline. The praise felt almost as invasive as the criticism he knew was coming. Julian's legal team, now in full-blown crisis mode, abandoned all pretense of subtlety. Their new objective was destruction. If they couldn't bury the video, they would destroy the credibility of the man who recorded it. They hired a team of ruthless private investigators, tasking them with one single objective: find dirt on Officer Michael Evans. They were instructed to dig into every aspect of his life, his academy records, his past arrests, his finances, his personal relationships. They were looking for any mistake, any complaint, any shadow that could be twisted and magnified in a courtroom to paint him as a bitter, overzealous cop with a vendetta against the successful. The pressure on Michael became immense. He was placed on administrative duty, pending an internal review, a standard procedure, but one that felt like a punishment. He was subjected to a grueling interrogation by Internal Affairs, where lawyers from Julian's firm were present, questioning his every action, his every motive. They implied he had leaked the video himself for fame or money. They suggested he had a history of targeting luxury cars. It was a relentless assault on his character, designed to make him crack, to make him doubt himself, to make him give up. The system he had put his faith in was now being used as a weapon against him. But Michael did not break. He answered every question calmly, factually, and consistently. He stuck to the truth of his report. The stress was taking a toll, visible in the dark circles under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders, but his integrity remained a solid, immovable object. Sarah watched him with a mixture of pride and terror, holding their family together as the storm raged around them. She screened the calls, shielded Lily from the news, and was a constant source of quiet strength for her husband. She knew the cost of his principles, and she was willing to help him pay it, even as it terrified her. Julian, meanwhile, had retreated from the world. He hadn't been to his office in a week. He lived in his penthouse like a phantom, the curtains drawn, communicating only with his lawyers. He obsessively scrolled through the torrent of online hatred directed at him, a form of digital self-flagellation. For the first time, he was seeing himself through the world's eyes, and the image was monstrous. The man on the screen, dripping with contempt, was a stranger to him, yet it was undeniably him. The arrogance he had always seen as strength now looked like a pathetic, brittle weakness. The foundation of his identity was beginning to crumble. The private investigators hit a wall. To their and Julian's utter disbelief, Michael Evans was clean. His service record was exemplary, with multiple commendations for bravery and professionalism. His finances were modest, but in perfect order. Interviews with former partners and neighbors painted a consistent picture: a quiet, decent, honest family man. There was no dirt to be found. The officer was exactly who he appeared to be. This revelation sent a jolt of genuine fear through Julian. He had built his life on the assumption that everyone had a price, everyone had a hidden angle. A man with none was an incomprehensible and dangerous variable. Frustrated, Arthur Croft's team filed a motion to have the bodycam evidence suppressed, arguing that the widespread media coverage had rendered it inflammatory and prejudicial to a fair trial. They claimed the leak itself was evidence of a conspiracy against Mr. Vance. It was a desperate, long-shot legal maneuver. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Eleanor Rios, listened to their arguments impassively and denied the motion in less than 5 minutes. "The evidence is the evidence, Mr. Croft," she stated, her voice sharp. "Your client's actions created the media coverage, not the other way around. The jury will see the video." The gavel fell like a death sentence on their strategy. The news of the judge's decision reached Julian in his darkened penthouse. There would be no escape. He would have to go to court and sit there while a room full of strangers watched his moment of ultimate weakness. He would have to face the officer whose life he had tried to ruin. In the days that followed, something inside him began to shift. The rage began to cool, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. He started watching the clip not with anger, but with a horrifying sense of detachment, as if studying a foreign species. Who was that man in the car? What had turned him into that sneering, hollow creature? The external conflict with the law and the media was slowly transforming into a brutal internal war. The arrogance that had been his armor for decades was now his prison. It had isolated him, blinded him, and led him to this precipice. He had spent his entire life running from the ghost of his father's weakness, only to become a different, more monstrous kind of weak man himself. The fear of irrelevance that drove him was now a self-fulfilling prophecy. In his desperate attempt to be somebody, he had become a caricature, a meme, a public lesson in what not to be. He was Julian Vance, a name that could once silence a room, but now it just felt like an epitaph. On the morning of the trial, Julian stood before his vast wardrobe, filled with dozens of identical, custom-tailored suits, his uniform of power. Today, it felt like a costume. He dressed with mechanical precision, his hands steady, but his mind was in turmoil. His reflection in the mirror was a stranger. The impassive, confident mask was there, but the eyes behind it were haunted. For the first time since he was a small, powerless boy, Julian Vance was truly, deeply afraid. He was not afraid of the judge, the fine, or the community's service. He was afraid of the man he was about to be forced to confront, himself. Michael Evans prepared for court in a different way. He put on his dress uniform, the fabric crisp and neatly pressed by Sarah. He hugged Lily, promising to take her for ice cream later. He and Sarah took the subway to the courthouse, holding hands the entire way, a silent partnership against the world. He wasn't a hero or a victim. He was just a man who had told the truth and was now prepared to repeat it under oath, regardless of the consequences. His strength wasn't in his bank account or his name. It was in the simple clarity of his conscience. The courtroom was packed. The press, the public, the curious all had gathered for the spectacle. Julian entered with his phalanx of lawyers, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He sat at the defendant's table, his posture perfect, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He refused to look at the gallery, refused to look at the prosecution, and most of all, refused to look at the opposite side of the room where Officer Michael Evans sat, calm and ready. The air crackled with anticipation. The stage was set not just for a legal proceeding, but for a collision of two worlds, a public reckoning that had been set in motion by a single arrogant question on a rainy night. Julian's lawyer, Arthur Croft, radiated a confidence he no longer felt. He arranged his papers, whispered last-minute instructions to Julian, and prepared to paint a picture of a persecuted visionary, a man whose momentary lapse in judgment was being unfairly magnified into a career-ending crime. He would portray Officer Evans as an opportunist, a man who saw a chance for his 15 minutes of fame by taking down a giant. It was a flimsy narrative, but it was the only one they had left. Julian listened, but the words were just noise. His focus was entirely internal, bracing for the impact of the inevitable. The prosecutor, a young, ambitious woman named Maria Flores, stood to make her opening statement. She spoke not of a billionaire tycoon, but simply of a defendant, a citizen who had broken the law and then attempted to use his status to place himself above it. This case, she said, her voice ringing with clarity, is not about wealth or fame. It is about a simple, fundamental principle, equality under the law. We have evidence that will show the defendant's actions and, more importantly, his mindset. We will show you the truth in his own words. She then turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to begin by playing the body-worn camera footage from Officer Evans' uniform." A large screen was wheeled to the center of the courtroom, directly in Julian's line of sight. A technician hit a button, and the screen flickered to life. The first image was the rain-streaked dashboard of the patrol car. Then, the shaky view of the officer approaching the Pagani. Julian felt his heart begin to pound against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He could hear the muffled sound of the rain, the calm, procedural voice of Officer Evans. It was happening. There was no escape. The entire room was silent, holding its collective breath, waiting to witness the moment his world began to unravel. He saw the window of his car slide down. He saw a glimpse of his own hand, the expensive watch on his wrist. Then the camera tilted up slightly, and he saw his own face illuminated by the officer's flashlight. The sneer, the look of utter disdain, it was more grotesque than he remembered. It was the face of a villain in a cheap movie. He heard his own voice, distorted by the microphone, dripping with a contempt that made his skin crawl. The entire courtroom was now hearing it, watching it. He was a specimen under a microscope, his ugliest moment laid bare for the world to dissect, and the weight of it was suffocating. Then came the line. The audio was perfectly clear. "Do you have any idea who I am?" The words echoed in the silent courtroom, amplified and monstrous. In that moment, Julian wasn't a billionaire or a CEO. He was just that pathetic, arrogant man on the screen. He chanced a glance at Officer Evans. The man wasn't watching the screen. He was watching Julian, his expression not of triumph or hatred, but of a weary, profound sadness. It was a look of pity, and that, more than the scorn of the world, was what finally broke him. The mask of Julian Vance, titan of industry, shattered completely. For a fleeting second, the entire courtroom saw it. The flicker of horror in his eyes, the subtle tremor in his jaw, the way the blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen. He was no longer looking at the screen, but through it, seeing a lifetime of arrogance, of loneliness, of fear, all culminating in this single, humiliating moment. He had spent his life building an identity around being powerful, and in 2 minutes, a small camera had revealed that his identity was built on nothing but a terrified ego. The self-deception was over. He was naked, and the truth was excruciating. The video ended. The screen went black, but the image of his face and the sound of his voice remained burned into the mind of everyone present, most of all, Julian himself. The prosecutor said nothing more, allowing the silence to hang in the air, a more powerful statement than any words could be. The foundation of Julian's world had been pulverized, and on the rubble, something new and terrifying and unknown would have to be built. The trial was only just beginning, but for Julian Vance, the verdict on his life had already been delivered. The external battle was secondary. The real war, the one for his soul, had just begun within the silent, cavernous space of his own shattered self-image. He felt Arthur Croft's hand on his shoulder, a gesture meant to be reassuring, but it felt like the touch of a ghost. Julian barely registered it. His mind was a maelstrom of shame and dawning self-awareness. He had always believed his name was a shield, but now he saw it for what it was, a brand, and he had just single-handedly destroyed its value. The market had corrected, and his personal stock had crashed to zero. He had lost something far more valuable than money or status. He had lost the delusion of his own greatness, and the reality of what was left was almost too much to bear. The day progressed in a blur. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented, but Julian was a spectator in his own life's drama. His focus remained inward, replaying the video in his mind, juxtaposing it with the image of Officer Evans' dignified calm. He saw the contrast between a man who had everything and felt nothing, and a man who had little and was sustained by his character. The wealth, the power, the penthouse, it all felt like a cheap costume. For the first time, he envied Michael Evans. He envied his clarity, his purpose, his quiet, unshakable sense of self. It was a form of wealth Julian had never known how to acquire. The prosecutor's case was simple and devastatingly effective. She didn't need to embellish. The video spoke for itself. She presented Michael's spotless record, his professionalism under duress, and contrasted it with Julian's belligerent and uncooperative behavior. Arthur Croft's attempts to cross-examine Michael were fruitless. The officer answered every question with simple, declarative facts, refusing to be baited into anger or speculation. His testimony was as clean and solid as his service record. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was simply reporting what happened, and his sincerity was undeniable. As the first day of the trial concluded, Julian felt a strange sense of relief. The worst had happened. He had been publicly exposed, his deepest flaws revealed. The dread that had been building for weeks was replaced by a strange, hollow calm. There was nothing left to hide, nothing left to protect. The fortress had been breached and its king dethroned. As he was ushered out of the courthouse through a mob of flashing cameras, he didn't even try to hide his face. For the first time, he let the world see him not as a titan, but as a broken man, and in that surrender, a tiny, unfamiliar seed of freedom began to take root. That evening, he dismissed his entire legal team from his penthouse. He sat alone in the dark, the city lights twinkling below like a distant, forgotten galaxy. He didn't drink. He didn't rage. He simply sat with the truth of who he had become. The journey to this courtroom had not started on that rainy night. It had started decades ago, in a small house with a bitter father, where a young boy decided that power was the only antidote to pain. He had been running a race against his own shadow his entire life, and he had finally been forced to stop and turn around. The man he had become was a stranger, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could not live as that stranger for one more day. The jury's deliberation was unnervingly brief. In less than an hour, they filed back into the solemn, wood-paneled courtroom, their faces impassive, their duty done. The tense silence was a physical entity, a weight pressing down on everyone present. Julian Vance sat at the defendant's table, his posture no longer rigid with defiance, but settled into a state of quiet resignation. The mask was gone, replaced by the weary, unguarded expression of a man who had finally stopped fighting the tide and was prepared to be carried by its current. He didn't look at his lawyer or the jury. His gaze was fixed on a point on the far wall, as if seeing a future he had already accepted. He had been found guilty in the court of public opinion for weeks. This was merely the formal codification of that verdict. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, stood and handed a slip of paper to the bailiff. She cleared her throat before speaking, her voice trembling slightly as it broke the room's stillness. On the charge of driving under the influence, we the jury find the defendant, Julian Vance, guilty. A wave of muted sound washed over the gallery, the soft gasp of spectators, the frantic clicking of camera shutters, the furious scribbling of reporters. Arthur Croft's shoulders slumped in defeat, while Prosecutor Maria Flores allowed herself a brief, tight-lipped smile of victory. Julian's reaction was the most profound in its stillness. He did not flinch. He did not sigh. He simply closed his eyes for a long moment, a silent, complete capitulation to the consequences of his actions. It was not a gesture of despair, but of acceptance. Immediately, Arthur Croft leaned in, his voice a low, urgent whisper in Julian's ear, already shifting to the next phase of the battle. "We'll appeal. We can argue juror prejudice from the media coverage. We have grounds, Julian. We can tie this up in the courts for years." But Julian slowly opened his eyes and turned to his lawyer, his gaze clear and steady for the first time in months. "No, Arthur," he said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the legalistic chatter. "No appeals." Arthur stared at him, bewildered. "Julian, this is professional suicide. It's—" Julian interrupted him again, with more force. "It's over. I accept it." It was his first true act of accountability, a definitive severing from the man who believed he was above the rules. The judge's gavel brought the room back to order. She set the sentencing for the following week, her expression as unreadable as ever. As Julian was escorted from the courtroom, the expected media frenzy erupted, a chaotic storm of shouted questions and flashing lights. In the past, he would have pushed through them with a cold, dismissive glare. Today, he walked through the gauntlet with a strange sense of calm. He didn't look at the cameras, but he no longer seemed bothered by them either. They were part of the consequence, part of the price. He was a convicted man, stripped of his illusion of invincibility. The identity of Julian Vance, the untouchable Titan, had officially died in that courtroom, and he felt a terrifying, liberating sense of lightness in its absence. The week that followed was one of profound solitude and introspection. Julian retreated to his penthouse, but not to hide. He instructed his staff to hold all calls, canceled all meetings, and disconnected from the news. He spent his days in the silent, sun-drenched living room, not staring at the city, but at blank pages in a leather-bound notebook. He wrote for hours, not preparing a legal defense or a PR statement, but excavating the ruins of his own life. He wrote about his father, his sister, the woman he'd left behind. He wrote about the consuming fear that had driven him to build an empire on a foundation of emptiness. It was a painful, raw, and brutally honest self-assessment, an autopsy of a soul he had long neglected. On the day of his sentencing, the courtroom was once again filled to capacity. The atmosphere was different now. The anticipatory buzz of a trial had been replaced by the grim finality of its conclusion. Officer Michael Evans was in attendance, sitting in the back row. He was not there to gloat or to witness a rich man's humiliation. He felt a professional and, strangely, a human duty to see the process through. He had been the catalyst for this man's downfall, and he needed to witness its resolution. He watched as Julian entered, noting the profound change in his demeanor. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a somber humility that seemed to alter the man's physical presence. Arthur Croft rose to address the court, holding a meticulously prepared statement. It was a masterpiece of legal contrition, filled with carefully chosen phrases designed to convey remorse without admitting excessive fault. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, "my client, Mr. Vance, feels profound regret for the incident in question. He has learned a valuable lesson about the responsibilities that come with his position in the community and understands that no one is above the law." He spoke of Julian's philanthropic contributions and the importance of his work at Nexus Dynamics, painting a picture of a good man who had made a single, uncharacteristic mistake. It was a sterile, impersonal plea for leniency. As Arthur finished, he turned to offer the written statement to Julian, who was expected to read it aloud to the court. But Julian gently shook his head, pushing the papers away. He rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate. The notebook he had been writing in all week remained on the table. He was going to speak from a place beyond legal strategy. A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. Julian was discarding the script, and in doing so, he was seizing control of his own narrative for the first time since that rainy night, but in an entirely new way. He did not turn to the judge's bench. In a move that stunned the entire room, he turned his body to face the gallery, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found their target. He locked his gaze with Officer Michael Evans. The space between them seemed to shrink, the rest of the room fading into a blur. For a moment, they were the only two people there. Julian's carefully constructed composure finally broke, his voice thick with an emotion no one had ever heard from him before. "Officer Evans," he began, his voice cracking on the name. "Mike, before I say anything else, I need to say I am sorry. I am truly, deeply sorry. The apology was not for the crime. It was for the sin. What you saw that night, what the world saw, was a man I no longer wish to be. A man so insulated by wealth and privilege that he lost sight of his own humanity. My behavior was not a mistake. It was a reflection of the arrogance I allowed to consume my life. I didn't just disrespect you as an officer of the law. I disrespected you as a human being, and for that, there is no excuse. The contempt in my voice that night was not for you. It was a poison I have been carrying inside me for years, and you were just the one who had to stand in its path." He took a shaky breath, the confession pouring out of him, raw and unpracticed. "I spent my whole life building an empire to prove I was powerful, to prove I was somebody. But when I look at you, I see a man who has a strength I never knew. You have integrity. You have a quiet dignity that my billions could never buy. I tried to have your life investigated, to find a flaw, to tear you down to my level, and there was nothing. You are a good man, Officer Evans. A better man than I have ever been." The admission hung in the air, a stunning repudiation of his entire life's philosophy. Then he did the unthinkable. He expressed gratitude. That night, you didn't see a billionaire. You just saw a citizen breaking the law, and you did your job. You treated me the way you would treat anyone else, and in doing so, you held up a mirror to my face. I was horrified by what I saw, but I am grateful that I saw it. Thank you. Thank you for not backing down. Thank you for your professionalism. You didn't just arrest me that night. You may very well have saved me from the man I was becoming. The words were a complete surrender, an act of demolishing his own ego in public view. Finally, he turned to face Judge Rios, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Your Honor," he said, his voice now steady with resolve, "I am not here today to ask for leniency. I am here to take responsibility. My actions were mine alone. They were dangerous, arrogant, and inexcusable. I broke the law, and I tried to use my name to escape the consequences. I am prepared to accept any punishment you believe is just. I have no excuses to offer, only my profound remorse and my commitment to becoming a better man." He then sat down, the silence in the courtroom absolute and deafening. The effect of his speech was seismic. Reporters who had been poised to write scathing articles about an arrogant tycoon's downfall were now looking at their notepads, dumbfounded. Arthur Croft stared at his client as if seeing him for the first time. Prosecutor Flores, who had prepared a sharp rebuttal to the expected legal maneuvering, slowly sat down, her own statement now seeming unnecessary. The raw, unvarnished humanity of Julian's confession had transcended the adversarial nature of the proceedings. It was no longer a legal hearing. It was a moment of profound personal reckoning. From the back of the room, Michael Evans watched, his own emotions in turmoil. He had come expecting a hollow, lawyer-coached apology. Instead, he had witnessed a man publicly dismantle his own soul and begin the painful process of rebuilding it. The anger and resentment he had harbored over the past few weeks, for the stress on his family and the attacks on his character, simply melted away. In its place was a surprising and unwelcome feeling, empathy. He saw not the monster from the video, but a broken man desperately trying to find his way back. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, of acceptance, of a strange and unexpected grace. Judge Eleanor Rios removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes, a rare break in her stern judicial demeanor. In her 20 years on the bench, she had heard every conceivable excuse, every polished apology, every desperate plea. But she had rarely, if ever, witnessed something so genuinely transformative. She looked at the man before her, a man who had entered her courtroom a symbol of arrogant privilege, and now sat as a symbol of profound remorse. She looked down at the sentencing guidelines, then back at Julian. The law demanded punishment, but the moment seemed to call for something more. It called for a chance at redemption. Judge Rios looked down at Julian for a long moment, the silent courtroom hanging on her every move. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm, yet laced with a nuance that went beyond mere legal judgment. "Mr. Vance," she began, "the court recognizes what appears to be a profound and genuine display of remorse. Remorse, however, is not a replacement for justice. The law requires a penalty for your actions." A ripple of anticipation went through the room. However, the judge continued, "This court also believes that the purpose of justice is not solely punitive, but also restorative. It is clear that sending you to a jail cell would punish you, but I am not convinced it would serve the community you have harmed." She sentenced him to the maximum possible fine of $50,000 and 2,000 hours of mandatory community service, to be served at a facility of the court's choosing. Julian listened to the sentence and nodded once, a clear, unambiguous sign of acceptance. He didn't wait to be prompted by his lawyer or the court. As the judge concluded, he turned to one of his aides who had remained in the courtroom. In a voice loud enough for the front rows to hear, he gave his first new command as a changed man. Wire $100,000 to the Police Benevolent Association's fund for the families of officers killed in the line of duty. Use the extra $50,000 to cover any and all court fees for Officer Evans' department regarding this case. Do it now. It was a simple, immediate act, a tangible first step that demonstrated his public apology was not just empty words. It was the beginning of making amends through actions, not platitudes. In the weeks that followed, the Julian Vance the world knew continued to dismantle himself. The Pagani Huara was the first to go, sold to a private collector in Dubai. It was followed by his collection of rare watches and a vacation home in the Hamptons. The press reported on these sales with cynical speculation, assuming it was a PR stunt or a sign of financial trouble. But the money didn't go back into his accounts. It was funneled into a newly created, anonymously managed charitable foundation, tasked with funding educational and mentorship programs for underprivileged youth across New York City. He was systematically converting the symbols of his arrogance into fuel for quiet, meaningful change, untangling his identity from the things he owned. His community service assignment took him far from the polished gleam of Manhattan to a struggling youth center in a tough neighborhood in the South Bronx. On his first day, he arrived in a simple black car, wearing a conservative suit, looking utterly and comically out of place. The center was a world of peeling paint, fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered, and the echoing sounds of worn-out basketballs on a cracked linoleum floor. The kids, mostly teenagers, eyed him with a mixture of suspicion and amusement. The center's director, a weary but tough woman named Maria, gave him a mop and pointed him toward the gymnasium floor. His first task was not to mentor or strategize, but to clean. The initial weeks were a series of humbling lessons. His corporate mindset was useless here. He tried to offer strategic advice on fundraising to Maria, who bluntly told him she didn't need a consultant, she needed someone to fix the leaky toilets. He attempted to connect with a bright but guarded teenage girl named Maya over her calculus homework, approaching it with the cold logic of a quarterly report. She rolled her eyes and told him, "It's easy to solve for X when you don't have to worry about Y and Z," pointedly looking around at the poverty of her surroundings. Every interaction was a reminder that his old tools of power, money, logic, and intimidation had no value in this new world. He had to learn a new language, the language of listening. The breakthrough came not in a grand gesture, but in a quiet moment of observation. He noticed a shy, skinny kid named Leo who spent every free moment on the center's ancient, barely functioning computer, trying to teach himself how to code. Julian saw a flicker of his own younger self in the boy's intense focus. Instead of offering to buy him a new laptop, he pulled up a chair. "Show me what you're working on," he said softly. For weeks, that became their ritual. Julian didn't lecture, he guided. He shared the knowledge and passion for technology that had been the one pure thing in his ascent, connecting with Leo not as a benefactor, but as a fellow creator. He was mentoring, not managing. Slowly, a visible transformation took place. The suits were replaced by simple jeans and sweaters. The guarded, analytical expression on his face softened, often replaced by a genuine smile as he celebrated a small victory with one of the kids. He used his connections not for personal gain, but to source 24 refurbished laptops, helping Leo and Maya set up the center's first real computer lab. He found a profound satisfaction in fixing a broken shelf or successfully mediating a dispute over a video game that no billion-dollar acquisition had ever provided. He was discovering that purpose wasn't found in a stock ticker, but in the feeling of being useful to another human being. True to his new path, Julian formally stepped down as CEO of Nexus Dynamics. He retained a non-executive seat on the board, but his daily life was no longer about profit margins and market shares. His life was the 4 train to the Bronx, the smell of disinfectant in the community center halls, and the challenge of earning the trust of kids whose lives were a million miles from the one he had known. He had lost an empire, but was gaining a community. He was no longer a name in a headline, but a consistent, reliable presence in the lives of young people who had been let down by almost everyone else. Months into his service, the center held a small open house to show off the new computer lab. Local parents and community members gathered, eating pizza from cardboard boxes under the humming fluorescent lights. Julian wasn't at the podium giving a speech. He was in the back of the room, helping a young girl design a logo for her imaginary cupcake business. He was laughing, a deep, genuine sound of uncomplicated joy. Maya, who had once dismissed him, was now proudly showing her mother the website she had built. In that small, unassuming room, Julian looked more at home, more genuinely powerful than he ever had in his own boardroom. His name, Julian Vance, was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was being quietly redefined, not by newspaper headlines, but by his daily actions. The moral of his story was being written not in a courtroom, but in the code Leo was learning, in the confidence Maya was gaining, and in the stability he was bringing to a small, forgotten corner of the city he had once claimed to own. He had learned that true wealth wasn't the ability to buy anything you wanted, but the ability to give something of yourself that was truly needed. His future was no longer a trajectory of accumulation, but a journey of contribution, and for the first time, it felt limitless. 2 years later, the sun shines brightly on the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the brand-new Vance Youth and Technology Center, a state-of-the-art facility built on the site of the old one. Julian, dressed in a simple, casual shirt and slacks, looks on not from the stage, but from the crowd. He is surrounded by the kids he has mentored, laughing as Leo, now a confident young man on his way to a full scholarship at MIT, helps the mayor cut the ribbon. The center was funded entirely by Julian's foundation, but his name is the only thing he insisted be kept small on the plaque. He is no longer seeking the spotlight. He is content to be the one who powers it for others. Across the crowd, he spots a familiar face. Detective Michael Evans, recently promoted, is there with his wife Sarah and a slightly older Lily. He had been invited personally by the community board. Their eyes meet. There is no lingering animosity, no awkwardness. They share a brief, knowing not a silent acknowledgement of the incredible journey that began on a rainy night. It is a nod of mutual respect between two men from different worlds, forever linked by a moment that had destroyed one life and ultimately saved it. Julian has found a new, more authentic form of power, the power to change lives for the better, starting with his own, proving that a person's true character is not defined by the height of their rise, but by the grace of their fall. What do you think truly defines a person's worth? Leave a little heart if you believe redemption is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more second chance stories. Comment love is priceless if you also believe in human kindness.